A study of the book of Romans, and let's see, I don't know if you have, does everyone have the handout? I guess not. Let me just go ahead and give the handout here. If you just pass this around to everyone and just, I guess you'd have to cross across. Let me just do 3. And we'll pass these out over here and just pass them back. This will at least give us some kind of basic guidance to use in going through the book. I've already given you a textbook you'll be using, and we'll talk more about that one here in a moment. But this is just a way to sort of guide us in our discussion. The textbook that I've asked you to use for the course is by Douglas Moo. Doug, a friend of mine, teaches at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. I think he's still there. Yeah, everybody keeps changing around. But this is a very thorough work on the book of Romans. I think you'll enjoy reading it. This will be for next week. The remainder of the books are here in front of you. These will be due the next time we come back. And so, actually, you don't have to read but the one book. So just to try to scare you a little bit, didn't do a very good job of it. But I used to use this book by John Murray, and I consider this a very outstanding book too. This is a very good book. The New International Commentary of the New Testament. If you'll notice, these are the same commentary series. What has happened is that Doug has replaced John Murray's book as the one in the commentary series. Now, you can still get John Murray's book, though. It's still published, I think, still by Erdman's. They've just taken it out of the series, and you can buy it as a single volume. John Murray was professor of systematic theology at Westminster Seminary in Philadelphia. Really quite a good book, and I think Doug will do a good job here too. But anyway, just to bring that to your attention. Now, another book you should be aware of is one by James D.G. Dunn. James Dunn teaches, where is he teaching now? I always lose track where everybody is. Yes, he's at University of Durham in England, and this is a very interesting study of Paul. Dunn is a well-known international scholar. Not quite as conservative as I would wish he was. He came out of the Tyndale Fellowship, which was pretty conservative, and then he sort of began to stray some. But nonetheless, it's still a fine work, and he's done some really good work. Some other books, I think this is now, you can buy this again. It's come back into print. This is the finest study, in my opinion, of Romans 9. Romans 9 is a hard text, as you will see when we go through it. And John Piper, if you've heard of John Piper, he's written a number of books. And John is a guy I guess I've known for 25 years. But John wrote, this was actually the basis of his dissertation. The Justification of God, an exegetical and theological study of Romans 9, 1 through 23. So that's the book, and I think that's available again now. It may have gone out of print, or at least it wasn't widely available. I thoroughly enjoy this book. This was a book for some time as my nighttime reading. I'd lie in bed and read this. It's different. F. Bruce is a man that had a tremendous impact on biblical studies. He was a professor of biblical criticism at the University of Manchester in England. Was an evangelical. You will see him in heaven. There's no doubt. Although some of the ones you read may not. But there are some guys that I read sometimes. They don't know any more about Jesus personally than the man in the moon, but they do write. But Bruce is a very fine scholar. Actually, he's now with the Lord, but raised in the Plymouth Brethren tradition. Went off and did honors and classics, and then at I believe it was it Aberdeen? I'm trying to think where he actually was giving his Doctor of Divinity. In England, Doctor of Divinity is different from Doctor of Divinity in America. In America, Doctor of Divinity degrees don't mean a thing. You might as well just go down and get it out of the pot machine. But in England, Doctor of Divinities actually have real weight, because what happens is that in England, if you've graduated from a school and then you become not only a scholar but one of the top people, in other words, you are viewed as almost like a hero of the university. I mean, you've arisen to such a fine status in your field that everybody recognizes you as a world-class expert. Then the university may award you a Doctor of Divinity degree, which is really of more value than probably having a PhD. In America, like I say, you can get them at the at the gum machine, or your church can give you one, or schools that have no academic credibility can give you one. So it's sort of a tragedy in America. I mean, you can, for my doctor of theology degree, all the years that I spent working on that thing, and the years on the dissertation, and not hundreds, but scores of exams, and including at the end. I mean, when you think about all the work and then somebody gets one basically just thrown at them, it really minimizes the value of sometimes doctorates in America, and most lay people don't know the difference between the two. I could give everyone in here a doctorate of divinity and have as much value as the DDs that are given out regularly. And but in England it means something. And Bruce actually does not have a PhD, he had a DD. But again, that was a very great honor. The book here by Donford, The Romans Debate, is, I think this may still be in print, but it lays out some of the questions about why the book of Romans. And a number of scholars that are well known, T.W. Manson from England, Günter Bornkamm from Germany, Karl Donfried, trying to think who else may be well known here, but several people wrote. This is something you may want to look at. I'm going to this later. Put this here. The last book to tell you about is the. I want to go back to Bruce's book a minute. I got to talk about Bruce, and I forgot to tell you about the book. But this is in a series. Are you familiar with this series? Ancient Christian Commentary series. Tom Oden is a guy I've known a long time, and Tom and I are friends. We usually have lunch together every year at ETS. He actually, in the earlier stages of this project, before any of them came out, he asked me if I would like to contribute a volume, and I told him no, I was just too busy. Sort of look back, I wish I'd sort of done one. These are really good. Very fine works. Ancient Christian Commentary series on Scripture, the New Testament, this on the book of Romans, edited by Gerald Bray. And essentially what this is that instead of writing a commentary like you're reading for Douglas Moo, what they did was have you, to be in this series, you had to be able to read Latin and Greek, because they would send the Latin and Greek fathers to you, and then you would go through and pick out the ones you thought were the best in a particular verse. So let's say like you'd look at Romans 1, verse 16, and you'd look through the various comments from various fathers, both in Latin and Greek fathers, as to Romans 16, what they understood, 1:16, what they understood it to mean, and then you would include it in as a commentary. You'd say, this is what the fathers thought it meant. Well, it's a unique approach, and I think that's very good. Matter of fact, I'm using the same approach in my systematic theology that will be coming out. I have a 4-volume systematic that I'm coming out with. And we're also coming out with about 4 or 5 other volumes in concert with the systematic theology, which will use this approach, both the patristic fathers, well, it's redundant, I realize, but the early church fathers, the medieval fathers, the theologians, the Reformation theologians, pre-modern, post-modern scholarship, and use a similar approach to what they're doing here, and then systematic. Let me just get back to Bruce just a second. I should tell you that I used to read this because I found it such an easy book to read. It was written in such a flowing and narrative style that it didn't seem like reading a scholarly book. It was just entertaining almost. It was really very good. I'd strongly suggest you buy this book. I thought it was one of the best things that Bruce wrote, and he wrote a lot. I love his little introduction. I've got to give this to you because I've used this in I don't know how many contexts before, and this is where I picked it up. Bruce writes and says, to my granddaughters, Helen, Anna, Esther, and Winona Mary, and my grandsons, Peter, Frederick, Alan, and Paul. Bearing in mind T.R. Glover's comment on a Roman emperor's condemnation of the apostle to the Gentiles, that the day was to come when men would call their dogs Nero and their sons Paul. What a twist of history, that the greatest, most powerful man in the world who judged Paul would one day only have dogs named after him. But people would call the person that he condemned by that name, Paul. I thought that was a very insightful statement here. So that sort of introduced some of the books. You may want to look at these sometime during a break or after class. I would encourage you to look at some of these books to buy. They would be good for your library. I picked out from my library which books I thought you would probably want to look at. So you may want to check those out. Now, as we move into the course here, then we need to talk about some other matters. One is, what are you required to do to actually pass this course? Anybody interested in that? Is everyone here taking this course for credit? Anyone that's auditing? So I'm actually going to expect something from each of you. Is that correct? Okay, good. Well, what I'm going to be expecting from you are two things. Each of these things are 50%. One is an exam, two is a paper. The paper is of your choosing, the exam of mine. Okay? The paper can be on any number of topics. I'm not looking for a heavy-duty paper. Matter of fact, I'm going to put a limit on it. I've decided to put limits on papers because I have had papers sometimes that are 15, 20, 30 pages long that are really quite good. More often than not, I've had 15 or 20-page papers that I just wish I didn't have to read. So what I'm going to do is put a maximum of 12 pages, a minimum of 8 pages. Somewhere between 8 and 12 pages, I expect your paper to be. Now, please understand that when I say 8 pages, it better be good 8 pages. You want to be more like around 10 or 11. But if you know, I can envision a very good paper being 8 pages, double spaced, somewhere around 10-point type. Okay, let's say 10-point type. And it should include footnotes. Listen to this very carefully. It should include footnotes at the bottom of the page in proper footnote form, used based on the style book adopted by the seminary here, I think which is Chicago. It should reflect not only books like commentaries, but it should reflect at least a third of your footnotes should be from journals of some sort. Scholarly works. Okay? The journals, you'll need to be careful how you do the form for those, but about a third from journals, because journals are where the technical, or I shouldn't say technical, but the more in-depth is what I mean. The more in-depth analysis of a given passage will be found, not in a book. What happens in a book is that they reflect what journals have written, and usually just give you tidbits from the journals. But the journals give you the more in-depth analysis. So I'd say a third from journals, and if you hand in a paper that has less than 30 footnotes, you probably haven't done any work yet. I wouldn't be in any way disappointed if you handed in 50 footnotes. And that indicates that you've spent some time reading and thinking and writing. Just to give you an idea, when I write an article, let's say if I write a 50-page article, probably it will at least have at least a couple of hundred footnotes in it at least. So to give you an idea when I write. Now I'm not expecting you to do that necessarily, but I just want you to know that what it indicates, you've actually spent some time reading and interacting. Okay? So be sure and keep that in mind on the paper. The topic can be on a number of things, but I would suggest you do it on a very narrow topic. In other words, do not write Paul's theology in Romans. I mean, that book has already been written. It's right here. Okay, it's this one right here. It's already been written. Okay, I'm looking for something more specific, some very specific issue. For example, I'll give you an example, and we'll be talking about that some tonight even. And that is when Paul quotes Habakkuk about the just shall live by faith. How is Paul using that passage over against how Habakkuk? Are they using it the same or differently? Dealing with that one specific statement could very easily be a 10 or 12 or 15 or 40-page paper. But that's a narrow topic at least. See, don't pick a major thing. Paul's doctrine of justification in Romans. Again, you need 500-600 pages to write that paper, not 10. Are you with me? Pick something narrow. And again, hopefully in the process of this course, you will gain a broad understanding of the book of Romans, as well as some specific understanding of certain areas. So that will come from the course. Your paper should reflect a very narrow interaction with the passage. Okay? So that you will be a very knowledgeable person about one specific narrow aspect of the book. Does that make sense? Okay. That's what I want. Now let me tell you about the exam. The exam, for those who are not at the doctor ministry level, will be, I already give you the question. Okay? I already give you the question, and you can prepare it anytime during the quarter, and as far as preparing to write it, I should say. It will be to take the book of Romans from your mind, not from the book. In other words, you don't have a Bible open, you don't have a book open. All you do is have a piece of paper, or actually several pieces of paper, and your pen and your mind. And from the beginning of Romans to the end of Romans, write to me the argument of the book. That's the exam. You need to be able to think your way chapter by chapter, section by section throughout the book of Romans and write the argument of Paul. See, the advantage of this exam, by the way, I've done this several times before, and I've had students to tell me that this is probably the most valuable exam they've ever had. I've had several. I was telling Chris on the way up here that I actually had a person that I haven't seen since 1980. She had my class in 79, and the first thing she said to me when she saw me about 3 weeks ago, she came up, "Oh, I'm so glad to see you. I loved your Romans class." And part of it related to the fact of what I expected them to do. You need to be able to actually... I had another student come to my office one day after the exam, before she graduated, I should say. And she said that exam was the best exam probably I ever had. And she liked the course too. But the reason why you need to be able to... If you were sitting across from someone, can you tell a person from your mind, what is Romans all about? How did Paul develop the book? How did he get to what he was trying to say? What were his arguments? What were his... You need to be able to think your way through the book and write it out. So that's the exam. Okay. Any questions?
Will it be a different exam?
Are you taking a D-Min? They'll be a little different. I'll have another little requirement for a D-Min because you're operating in a doctoral ministry level. We'll probably talk individually. How many are D-Min in here? Just two? We'll talk individually. You'll do those two things and probably... We can either maybe increase the number of pages on your paper or we'll do something a little different for the additional grade. For Eric, he'll be required to read also Dunn's book and Bruce's book. You're okay. So, anyway. Any other questions? Well, let's begin. The book of Romans, one of my favorite books. I hope you can know that, and I hope I bring over to you a contagion, because I find the book of Romans to be one of the most fascinating books in the entire Bible for several reasons. But one, it is a very strong theological argument by the Apostle Paul, differently than he does in any other book. There's really hardly another book in the New Testament that does a kind of argument. If I were to say what is the other book, it'd probably be the book of Hebrews, written by another author than Paul, but I think heavily influenced by the apostle. There are many reasons why Paul did not write Hebrews, and I'm always amazed when I have people argue that he did. But he was clearly influenced by Paul, but he was by a different author. But Paul has written a very fine book here in which he draws together as someone who was highly trained in the Hebrew Scriptures. He was a rabbi. He knew the Hebrew Scriptures backwards and forwards. He had not necessarily understood the application of those Scriptures to the Christ, the Messiah, until he had an experience that began in the Damascus Road and it culminated in Damascus itself, on the street called Straight. But here the apostle writes a book that probably has been the major book in many people's lives. I know Augustine was heavily influenced by Romans and coming to Christ. Martin Luther was heavily influenced by Romans and coming to Christ. It was very important to John Calvin and many others. The book of Romans has traditionally been a book that has turned lives upside down. Now, there's some things in the book that will turn you upside down if you haven't thought about them very clearly or very deeply. The book of Romans is not for a novice. It's for someone who really wants to delve into serious theological thinking. It's not a letter in the traditional sense, in the sense that it is just, solving a couple of problems. Now, it does deal with problems, don't get me wrong, but it's a treatise, is what it is. It's more than a letter. It's a treatise of theology. And certainly there are different views on why Paul wrote the book, and I'll be talking about some of those questions here as we move through. I'm not really going to start off, first of all, with a study of the book. We're going to take some time and talk about who's Paul, because you need to understand the person behind this book. But once we deal with Paul, then we'll talk about why the book. And we'll talk about the structure of the book and try to see if we can understand it. And so keep that in mind as we go through here. Now, first of all, I want to get an idea who I'm talking to. How many in here work in Greek? Let me see your hands. Can work in the Greek language?
I've got a limited...
Can you read the Greek New Testament? Can you read portions of the Greek New Testament?
Yeah, I can make out words.
No, I'm not saying make out words. I mean read it. Okay. There's a difference between making out a word and reading.
I took Greek for a limited number of days and then had to leave.
Okay, you could probably pronounce it, but you wouldn't be able to pick it up and read it, because we'll be working from the Greek text some, but I just need to know how much based upon the knowledge level in here. So apparently no one knows Greek enough. Maybe Eric does. Are you working Greek?
Yeah, I'm just slow. So
Okay, that's fine.
I'm going too fast.
Well, we'll just be reading it slow too. So I'll be referring to Greek on occasion when it's appropriate. So if you do not know Greek, all I encourage you to do is just simply write down what I say about it. You don't necessarily know. I'll write some Greek on the board. You can write the letters out. You can learn how to write them. And you'll learn how to say a few words you didn't know before. But in a course like this, I think it's important that we at least be somewhat connected to the original text. Because as you know, as A.T. Robertson once said, he said, the Greek New Testament is the New Testament. All else is translation. And so we have translations of the Bible, and then we have the Bible. Can you see the distinction between those two? You look at the front, they'll all be translations of the Bible. What's the Bible? The Bible is the Hebrew, the Aramaic, and the Greek. And someone who's going to be teaching others regarding, at least teaching authoritatively regarding the text, should become familiar with the text. That is the Greek and the Hebrew and stuff. And now, if you do not already have training in the Greek because you've had several years of training, you at least should become familiar with the tools that help you to begin to understand what the text is saying. Tools that will help you to do word studies, understand grammar. For example, Cleon Rogers' work on the linguistic, I can't think of the name of it now, but Cleon Rogers' Linguistic Key to the New Testament, or something like that, I think it's called, helps you to understand grammatical aspects. And of course, Robertson's Word Pictures in the New Testament, which you can buy almost for nothing anymore on Christian Booksellers Discount, whatever it's called. CBD, Christian Book, CBD, Christian Booksellers Discount. Distributors, that's what it is. Okay, CBD. You can buy Robertson's probably for $25 or $30, a good investment. Robertson's Word Pictures of the New Testament. A.T. Robertson was the king, as it were, of Greek grammarians, and a very fine scholar and a thinker and evangelical. Also, you have works like Weiss Word Studies. You have many word studies. You should become familiar with those. Linguistic tools, you should become familiar with those. Also, things like accordance, logos, other kinds of tools. We live in a day where lots of things are available, but some people don't consult them. So I expect people that are going to be the teachers of the Word would do the consultations. So let's first of all then start off and talk. Our first portion, if you're taking notes, is a look at the Apostle Paul. Who is this man that wrote this book called Paul? And there's several things we need to understand about the Apostle. There are some obvious things, like he was born in a city called Tarsus, which is in southeastern, what we think of as Turkey, Asia Minor. He was born in Tarsus. He was born apparently to a fairly wealthy family. Why do I know that? Because he was sent away and was able to study under the finest legal, or the finest scriptural and legal thinker of his day, Gamaliel. I mean, your average person walking down the street didn't have a chance to do that. I mean, from a Jewish standpoint, Paul went to a Harvard or a Yale. He studied under the finest thinker of his day, Gamaliel. And so he had to be from some family with prominence. He was also a Roman citizen, being born in Tarsus because it was a Roman provincial city. And one of the ways that Rome rewarded areas is by giving Roman citizenship to certain cities that were prominent, who were, they seemed to get along well with Rome. They were not viewed as insidious or revolutionary, and they provided benefits to Rome. So we know that about his background in that sense. Now, how does Paul's Pharisaic rabbinical background, how does that relate to him as an apostle and as a writer of a New Testament book? Rabbis were well trained. Matter of fact, if you, I don't know how familiar you are with certain people's training, but it's sort of like Roman Catholic priests tend to be very well trained. Usually better trained than, may not be as much today as it used to be, but usually better trained than most Protestants are trained, because we oftentimes don't see the need to go through the kinds of study that some of those do. And the rabbis are certainly the same way. They fully give themselves to the study of the Scriptures. And also, in Paul's day, they would have been not only well trained in Scripture, they would have also been trained in oral tradition. I might even say, as an aside, that probably rabbis in Paul's day were better trained than rabbis today, and in the reference to the Scripture, because rabbis today are almost totally interested in rabbinic tradition, whereas rabbinic tradition was being developed, but they were also very knowledgeable of Scriptures. That becomes very obvious when you read the New Testament. So Paul was a rabbi, a Pharisee. Pharisee, by the way, does not mean something bad. Even the Talmud itself recognizes several classifications of Pharisees. A couple that recognizes as being similar to what even Christ describes Pharisees to be. On the other hand, it also recognized good Pharisees. And I think in the days of Jesus, not every Pharisee was a bad person. Some were not very good, others were probably better. So a rabbi, what's the difference between a rabbi and a Pharisee? Were all Pharisees rabbis? What was the difference between a rabbi and a Pharisee?
The difference was that the rabbi was
A teacher.
The Pharisee was a scholar.
Right. Rabbis were teachers. Not within the Pharisee group would be teachers, and Paul was one of them. Not every Pharisee was a rabbi, but Paul was. Now, he certainly used rabbinic interpretation sometimes as to the interpretation of the passages. And I'm not going to get into interpretive issues. Those are some interesting questions. There's a good book by Richard Longnecker on apostolic exegesis. I can't think of the name of it, but Richard Longnecker, R-O-N-S-E, L-O-N-G-E-N-E-C-K-E-R, I believe is how it's spelled. Richard Longnecker taught many years at University of Toronto, and he is an evangelical and believer in inerrancy. I don't know if he's still there, but he was many years there, and he wrote the little book on apostolic exegesis. And he discusses various kinds of rabbinic interpretive methods. One called Pesher, for example, and Gematria and other forms of interpretation by the rabbis that found their way into some of the ways in which the New Testament writings were understood. But I'm not going to cover that aspect. Paul was not only influenced heavily by his background of Judaism. By the way, you'll notice Paul never denigrates the fact that he was a Jew, nor that he was a Pharisee, or that he was a scholar, or any of these. I mean, he appreciated his background. It's just that his background was insufficient to accomplish certain things, and that's how even ourselves. I mean. There's nothing wrong with being educated and knowledgeable about issues, but that won't bring you to Christ necessarily. But you don't have to sort of throw it aside and say it's worthless. Now, Paul said it's worthless in reference to redemption and salvation. He says he counts all those things in his life. Being a Hebrew of Hebrews, he counts all those things in his life as worthless to gain Christ. But you have to understand, he's dealing with a contrast there. It's like, we could do the same thing, or we could say something like, I don't count anything I have of any value in contrast to having heaven. But that doesn't mean there's nothing of value. See? So you have to understand how the particular presentation is given. Now, secondly, Paul is he's not only concerned with the question of his Jewish background, And again, I've already said, he's in Judaism. By the way, is Judaism and Jewishness the same thing? Can you be a person in Judaism and you not be Jewish? Can you be a Jew and not be in Judaism? Yeah. Now, you won't find every person to agree with that within the Jewish community. I know I spent quite a bit of time talking to the national leader of the Anti-Defamation League for the American Jewish League. And he was willing for a Jewish person to be New Age, a Jewish person to adopt Buddhism, a Jewish person to be an atheist. The only thing that a Jew could not be is a Christian. Because to be a Jew and a Christian, he said, were opposite. It was impossible to be a Christian Jew. But of course, one of the points I made to him that every single Jew that was a Christian for at least the first decade of the Christian, the Christian movement, for at least the first decade, there was not anything but Jewish Christians. And for at least 4 centuries in Israel, we know of a very strong Jewish Christian community there that existed alongside of non-Jewish Christianity. Or not, I should say non-Christian Judaism, maybe I should say it that way. So you had a strong movement for several centuries there, even in Israel, among the Jewish community. It's just that gradually as time went over, a Gentile community took it, basically became the predominant way of thinking about, Christianity was in Hellenism, which is another issue then. Paul was involved in Hellenism. So he had a Pharisaic background and he had a Hellenistic background. Now, in Hellenism, how we know about Paul being Hellenistically influenced was that he uses many of the literary styles and techniques of rhetoric that were used in the Hellenistic community. He was very knowledgeable in Greek. He had a good knowledge of Greek. Certainly he was a person that had traveled widely in the Hellenistic world and was able to communicate with people who were Hellenists. He uses a lot of terminology, Greek political terminology, Greek game terminology. Many of his illustrations, commercial, legal, has references to Hellenistic slave trade. He just has a lot of understanding of the Hellenistic community. Now, that's not true of every Jew, because there were many people in, for example, Israel in the first century, Judea, Samaria, who had not traveled from, a few miles away from Jerusalem. And all they were familiar with was Judaism in a very narrow framework. And Paul had widely traveled. He knew the world. He was a Roman citizen. He spoke Greek, again, as I said, and he was able to interact with the world. So he, again, was born in Tarsus, which, being a Roman city, was something a little anathema to many of the people who were, the Zealots, for example, who rose in 66 and eventually brought the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70 because of the rebellion against Rome. These people saw no place to have association with Rome. Paul didn't have quite the same perspective. He grew up in a Roman city. And even though he was fervent for the faith of the fathers, he nonetheless did understand how to move beyond those circles. And that becomes very evident in his writings as well as just what we know of him in his early history. Now, a third thing that probably had a major influence on Paul, so is first of all his Pharisaic Judaism, rabbinic background. Secondly, his Hellenistic influences. But the third influence on Paul the Apostle, and probably the most dramatic, is what we would say was the revelation of Christ that he received. The one I had here, I think I have another one. This was the better one, I think. Yeah, that's a better one. I'll use that now. The revelation that Paul had of Christ on the road to Damascus is what probably influenced all of his experience. When he came into contact with the risen Lord, then his life changed. Now, there's no indication whatsoever, to our knowledge, that Paul ever had any contact with Jesus when he was walking around Judea and Samaria and so forth. Jesus spent a lot of time teaching up in the Galilee, by the way. If you really look at Jesus, the only time he has any real goings-on in what we think of as Judea is when he went down to the feasts. Other than that, he basically stayed in the Galilee, more particularly around Capernaum, the city of Nahum. Kaper Nahum in Hebrew is the city of Nahum. And if you go to Jerusalem, or not Jerusalem, if you go to Israel, and you go up there, you'll see it's just that's where Nahum had a lot of his influences. Of course, I think Jesus sounds a lot like Nahum. Now, Paul had this experience on the Damascus Road. Now, several times in his writings, he makes mention of the fact that he had this revelation from the Father. Galatians 1:16, 1 Corinthians 9:1, 1 Corinthians 15:8, 2 Corinthians 4:6, Acts 9:5. He speaks in 1 Corinthians 2:8 of the crucified Lord of glory. So we don't have any knowledge that Paul met Jesus in the flesh while he was on earth. But nonetheless, he did have this experience. And what's significant about this is that, remember, a requirement to be an apostle, in reference to the 12, according to Acts 1, was that they had to be a follower of Jesus from the baptism of John up through the resurrection. Correct? That was a requirement. Acts chapter 1 tells us that. They picked out Matthias as one of the ones who had a right to take the apostleship of Judas based on his being an eyewitness. See, it was not particularly significant to declare yourself as an apostle if you couldn't say, I was there. See, it's not good enough to say, I heard. I heard that Jesus was a great guy. Now, you had to be an eyewitness. Well, along comes Paul, out of nowhere, formerly having been a persecutor of the Christians, the Jews, at this point. And let me say that in our early terminology, the word Christian, originated in Antioch, Christianos. The term was essentially you were a follower of the way, or something of that sort. You have Messianic Judaism, and I should have probably said something about this a while ago. But remember, until AD 70, there were different groups of Jews. You had a party of the Sadducees, you had the Herodians who followed Herod the Great. You followed the Essenes who were down in Qumran primarily. Some up in Jerusalem, though. There was a pretty good group of Essenes, maybe 5,000 in Jerusalem, away from the Dead Sea area. You had the Zealots who were the revolutionaries. And you had the Pharisees and the Sadducees. These are the various parties, all competing for followers. Along came Jesus declaring himself to be Yeshua Mashiach, Yeshua the Messiah. And those who followed him then were Messianic Jews. See, and there were no other kinds of people who were followers of Messiah than the Jews, as I mentioned earlier. And so you just added another party among all these other parties. But what happened in AD 70? The Sadducees no longer around. They're all dead, as was the temple. The Zealots were killed in the war. The Essenes were wiped out by the Romans on the way to Jerusalem at the Dead Sea. The Herodians went out of existence essentially because Herod the Great was no longer around. The only two groups you have left in Israel after AD 70, the only two groups, were the groups they called the Nazarenes. They called them the Nazarenes. And the Pharisees. That's it. So now you had two competing groups. The Nazarenes, who followed Jesus, believed that Messiah had come. And the Pharisees, who then established by AD 100, had established a rabbinic Judaism. That's what our modern Judaism comes out of rabbinic Judaism of the Pharisees that occurred at Yavne, or sometimes called Jamnia, on the coast of in Galilee. Okay, so these are the competing groups. So if you want to read about this more, I wrote this a pretty lengthy discussion on this, quite a few pages, on this very issue in a book called Israel, the Land of the People, one of the books that I sell. That I did, if you ever want to read that. But you go into it in great depth. But the thing you need to understand is that, so you have these competing systems. And Paul found himself between the twixt, so to speak. He's between the two. He's still benefiting out of his Pharisaism, but bringing to bear other information. Now that we find out he's not one of the 12, but what happens? How does he become an apostle? Well, the fact is, he says, I have seen the Lord. I can give testimony that Jesus, in fact, has risen. Now, he could not give testimony that he was with him from the baptism of John. So that seemed to be an important statement for Peter in Acts chapter 1, but Paul doesn't fit. He is one born out of time, he calls himself. He's unique. I do not believe that, and this is a bad mistake, I do not believe that the disciples or apostles, I should say, because there were many disciples who were not apostles. All apostles are disciples, not all disciples are apostles. You know, understand that. Paul was not meant to be the 12th apostle. Some people have argued that. The disciples or the apostles were acting out of sorts. You know, they were acting out of the Spirit, blah, blah. You know, they brought in Matthias. They shouldn't have. God intended apostle or Paul to be the 12th. No. Yeah. Because actually, Paul was not to be an apostle to the Jewish people like the others. Remember? The 12 primarily were keyed in more particularly to the area of Jerusalem, Judea, and so forth. Paul was specifically an apostle to the Gentiles. The other 12 actually had been sent to the house of Israel at one point. Now, I understand that they also went into the world based on Matthew 28 and so forth, but they had a different kind of ministry. There's no indication that Paul will be, according to the book of Revelation. Remember the book of Revelation talks about the 12 tribes? You have the 12 apostles because you have the 12 tribes. These are Jewish things. Paul, even though he was a Jew, was very Gentile-oriented. Okay. The revelation made a big, big difference. And a couple things that the revelation did. One, it demonstrated to Paul the unity of salvation for all people. In other words, God had unified divine action to save everyone, both in the old and new dispensations, the age of grace, the age of law. God cares and wants to save all. So the first thing the revelation of Christ taught to Paul then is this idea that the Father sent the Son to be the Savior of all people. And Paul saw this to be, certainly, he pushed this very strong. He had a lot of resistance, by the way, to the idea that Gentiles could be saved apart from Judaism. Now remember, the Jews, even the apostles at this point, were slow to learn this. Now I understand why they were slow to learn this. First of all, they were not, and don't get me wrong, I'm not saying the apostles were all a bunch of dummies, but they were not sophisticated thinkers like Paul. They really weren't. They were your average labor person. I mean, they were out there fishing. They were not scholars of the languages. They were not. They were not your top level thinkers even. I mean, and there's nothing wrong with them. I mean, you don't have to be a top level thinker to do good things for God. I'm not suggesting that. Dwight L. Moody was not. I mean, and he look all that he did. But if you'll recognize that the New Testament, Old Testament were not written by your average Joe. They were written generally by people who were very heavy-duty scholars. I mean, Isaiah was a brilliant man. His Hebrew is outstanding. And even some of the ones that some people think are lesser. I mean, most of these people were very educated who wrote the Bible. And so, and you do have certainly works from people like John and Peter and others. but oftentimes with help. There's no question in my mind that Peter wrote 2 Peter. By that I mean he transcribed it. I think he actually was the author of both books. But he transcribed 2 Peter because the Greek is so bad. Whereas 1 Peter is very good Greek and helped by Silvanus. So, you know, you have that kind of situation. So, Paul was able to put these things together much quicker than were the 12. Again, partly because he was probably more cosmopolitan in his thinking. See, he had been other places. And he had worked through some of these ideas, and they had not. For the Jewish community, generally speaking, if you wanted to be a Christian, you could. You just had to become a Jew. See, they didn't understand that there were non-Jewish Christians and Jewish Christians. They just thought, like it used to be, was Ruth a Jew? She became part of the Jewish community. They were willing to accept a Cornelius in as a proselyte of the gate, but he had not actually become a full-fledged member of the community. If you wanted to become a Jew, you know, you essentially became part of the community. You were circumcised, you went through all the procedures, you followed the law, and you know. But see, now Paul's coming in saying, well, yeah, that's all good and proper, but you can also become a participant without going through all of that. Now, if you'll notice, Paul he actually circumcised Timothy. I never have quite understood all of that. I can't imagine doing that to some guy. But nonetheless, he circumcised Timothy, but he would not circumcise Titus. Why? Timothy was Jewish in his background. Had a Gentile father, a Jewish mother. Titus was a pure Greek. So he says, you don't circumcise Greeks because you can become a Christian and part of Christ's covenant purely as a Gentile. Same thing Cornelius had, see. Or the Philippian jailer. On the other hand, Timothy, he could go through because he's a Jew. So Paul didn't try to do away with Jewishness. He just said there's Jewishness and non-Jewishness. Both can be participants in the same covenant. And so that's an important feature Paul understood. But he saw the unity of salvation, not the disunity. The second thing about Paul was that the vision taught him the soteriological value of the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. His basic theology didn't change, just his Christology. Let me see if I can illustrate that to you here. There's some important things to recognize here. Paul's basic theology did not change, merely his Christology. Now let me emphasize that a little bit. Since you made that comment, I think probably would be good for me to go into it a little more. You have to realize that the Jews did not have to learn a new theology, generally speaking. Jesus was trained as a Jew. Why? Because he was a Jew. And the view of God the Father, the view of salvation, the view of the law, all these things in the Hebrew Scriptures, Jews could understand them from the text. And there's nothing theologically wrong about the Old Testament. Now, I realize that a lot of churches act like they're Marcions and they've adopted a canon within the canon so that you never hear anything but Paul's epistles, and here I'm teaching Romans, but the thing is, I like other books too. I've taught Old Testament books too, because the point of it is, all Scripture is God-breathed and is profitable for doctrine, for reproof, for correction, and instruction in righteousness, that the man of God might be thoroughly equipped for every good work. All Scripture, see. So we should not have a canon within the canon. You know, we only go to Paul. The only time we ever hit the Old Testament is to look at the Psalms. You know, the whole Bible should be preached, verse by verse, even Leviticus. The whole Bible should be preached, Old and New Testament. Paul understood that. He clearly did. Jesus understood that. Matter of fact, what I always find so amazing, people avoid Leviticus so much, and yet when you read Jesus' teaching in the Gospels, he borrows a lot of his, what we call the new insight. Here's no new insight. He's quoting Leviticus so many places in Deuteronomy. Jesus picks up his theology from the Hebrew Scriptures. The view of God in the Old Testament is oftentimes, matter of fact, much better in presenting the the triune God. I realize he's not spoken in Trinitarian terms. That's a New Testament revelation. But the concept of God, his nature, other than the Trinitarian aspects, are more fully developed in the Old Testament than they are in the New. Really so. So we have to be biblical Christians, not merely New Testament Christians, see. So, but see, Paul didn't change his theology. His view of God the Father was still the same. His view of salvation was basically the same. All these things were the same. His view of the end of the world still the same. Paul, in my opinion, clearly believed in a future for the nation of Israel as a people. I think he believed in viewpoints that are consistent with the Hebrew Scriptures and the promises to the Jewish people as a future, a restoration to come. I think Paul believed all of that. But what changed for Paul was his Christology. This is the added dimension. Because the Old Testament presents a Messiah who is to come. But until the Messiah came, there was not a complete understanding of how all that made sense from the Old Testament. There is a reason why, folks, and you probably don't even know this because it's not talked about much. And this is an area of special interest to me. I hope to actually write as soon as I finish the series of things I'm doing for this decade, I'm planning in the next decade to write about a 7-volume set on Jesus the Messiah. And there's a number of things that need to be developed and that haven't been very well. And the point of it is that the Messiah that we see talked about in the New Testament, that is not a unique idea because get this now, pre-first century rabbinic scholars understood Isaiah 53, for example, as being a reference to the coming Messiah. It's only post-first century rabbinic scholars who begin to see Isaiah 53 as referring to something else than the Messiah to come. Now, I don't think it's any accident that Jesus so closely fulfills Isaiah 53. And when you look at the preaching of the New Testament church in the first century among Jewish people, the apostles and others, how Jesus is the fulfillment of the Old Testament, they were not coming up with this uniquely so. For they were sharing in common with those scholars that preceded Christ in the rabbinic circles. And it was obvious then to the rabbis by the end of the first century that this constant quoting of the Old Testament by Christians regarding the Messiah too closely equated the facts of the real life of Christ and his death and resurrection. See? So they had to find a way to move away from that. Does that make you understand what I'm getting at? A lot of people don't realize that, but that's actually how the rabbis wrote. What you see in the New Testament is not unique to them. See? They are consistent with how it was viewed. The only difference was the rabbis prior to the first century were saying this is the way it will be, and the church came along with the kerygma, the preaching material of the church, and said, not only was this what was to come, but it is what did happen. He truly did fulfill what people have been saying he would. See? And that was a powerful message. And that's why some people estimate that possibly as many as 40% of Israel in the first century were made up of Nazarene Christians. Thousands came to Christ because the message about what the Messiah would be begins to make a lot of sense among the rabbis. Now, it is true there are dimensions, don't get me wrong, there are dimensions of messianism that were not fulfilled that caused disarray in certain circles because not only Isaiah 53, but how do you deal with the fact of his kingship? He didn't become king. And so they were trying to figure out, well, all those other things, yes, okay, born in Bethlehem, born of a virgin, this and that, and all these kind of things, suffered and died. But some of them had struggles with the fact, we believe all that, but or maybe they don't believe that, but whatever happened to the messianic prophecy of Davidic kingdom? Well, see, from my perspective, and I think from Paul's perspective, it's the fact that it was not yet to be fulfilled, that it is still to be fulfilled there was both a first coming of Christ and a second coming of Christ in which all the remainder will be fulfilled. I think it is no accident that when Jesus goes to the synagogue in Nazareth, his hometown, and he stands up and reads as a rabbi. By the way, he was viewed as a rabbi. He probably had the rabbinic garb and everything, just like Paul. And he stood up to read the Torah. And by that I mean the not the Torah in the sense of the first 5 books. He stood up to read this reading out of the prophets. When he stood up and read from Isaiah 61, it's no accident that he says all these statements and ends with the statement, "In the vengeance of the day of our God." I mean, why did he come to this passage? This is a significant statement. It gives you a perspective of Jesus' view of prophecy. And this is picked up, I think, by Paul, because we're going to get into Paul and see that he held a view of something different too. Am I thinking of the right passage? Oh, I know what. No wonder I can't read. I'm reading. It's important to get the right chapter. The Spirit of the Lord God is upon me, because the Lord has anointed me to preach good tidings to the poor. He has sent me to heal the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives, and the opening of the prison to those who are bound, to proclaim the acceptable year of the Lord. And then he closed the book, Luke says. Why? Why didn't he finish the verse? Because he said, "This day, this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing." Well, see, that portion was fulfilled, but he didn't get to the second portion, "and the day of vengeance of our God." Because had he done that, he couldn't have said it was fulfilled, because that time is still to come. So he understood what he was doing and what he wasn't doing. So,
Where was that? What you just read?
Isaiah 61, the first several verses there.
So you were reading from Luke 4.
No, I was reading Isaiah 61. But you can turn to Luke 4 and see Jesus in Luke 4 is reading Isaiah 61. Okay?
Well, Dr. House, do those verses equate to the gospel? Is
Oh.
that the Old Testament portrayal of the gospel?
That's the Old Testament portrayal of the Messiah.
Proclaiming the gospel.
Well, that's on one thing he did.
Right.
But there's more that he did.
Right.
For example, taking care of the poor is not part of the gospel.
True.
Although it is a very important Christian work of charity that we should do. Some people use the word gospel so broadly it means everything. I'll teach you Paul's teaching of the gospel. We'll get to that maybe someday. Because we have to get to verse 16 to get there, and it may take me next week to get there. But we'll talk about what the gospel is and what the gospel is not when we get to that point. But no, that is not the statement of the gospel. That is the ministry of the Messiah, which was broader than the gospel. Certainly, dynamic, very important part was the gospel, but it was only part of the whole ministry of the Messiah. See, the ministry of Messiah to sit on David's throne, as promised by the prophets, is not part of the gospel. The gospel is only one part of the entire program of God. God has a broader program. God has, okay, do you understand me then? Some people get it mixed up and use the word the gospel, and they use the word gospel for the whole scriptures. Now, the gospel is a very specific thing. God's kingdom is broader than salvation. God's plan for the universe is broader than salvation. Salvation is a very dynamic and important part of it, for sure. But Christ came to die not only to save, but to do some other things. And He will come back to reign also. So that's another issue.